So, Pankaj, we're honored to have you. And you and I decided that rather than you do a talk, we'll have a conversation. And I'll ask you a few questions, and then the conversation will take a life of its own. So, Pankaj, the first one is a whole question about the optics of last week. Last week, the entire world was attracted by the optics of what happened in Beijing with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Victory Parade in China. Many had different views about it in the Western media. Initially, there was a bit of reluctance to even highlight it, but a week later, there was a lot of coverage, some of it positive, a lot of it neutral, or even plainly negative. What's your take on it? Some called it the birth of the post-Western world. Others said it was perhaps the most significant manifestation of the New World Order emerging. So, what was your take on this, Pankaj?
Thank you, Chandran. I think we are definitely living through a world historical moment, an extraordinary shift in both power and perception, I would say. I was just in Mexico last week and did a few interviews there, and almost every journalist I spoke to about six or seven, wanted my views on this summit. And as you say, there's quite a sort of unprecedented conjuncture. So I think there's a lot of curiosity about what the shape of the world order is going to be after what we see. And it's very clear what is happening in the United States is a kind of implosion, really, of American power, of American legitimacy, and its ability to impose its own rules on the rest of the world is extremely limited. I think there's a broad recognition that that ability has been severely curtailed. So, what's coming next? Whether it's something that actually China supervises, or that remains to be seen. But there is something, definitely, something huge has shifted in people's imagination, in people's perception all around the world. So, this is a very extremely crucial moment. My own take is that, look, I think people who gathered in Beijing, they represent many different countries, many different interests. Some of those interests are clashing interests. Those interests are not perfectly aligned. What they are certainly brought together by is a shared distrust, suspicion, and increasing disdain for a rogue superpower in the form of the United States. A dislike of bullying, a dislike of aggressive threats, aggressive wars, not just threats, kind of global disorder that the United States has now devoted itself to. And I think people are looking for a respite from all that. And so I think that was the significance of that meeting in Beijing last week. People coming together to simply to affirm that we are not going to put up with this kind of aggressive bullying behavior from the United States, and that we are capable of forming a front of sorts. Whether or not that front is actually achievable is another question, but we have to make a stand, essentially.
Thank you, Pankaj. So, based on that, and given that we are here talking about China's role in this evolving world, and the whole series has been based on that, how do you view China's evolving role in this context, particularly? Some people see China as a possible balancer, suggesting a more neutral and stabilizing force. Others argue that China is reshaping the geopolitical landscape in ways that are either constructive or disruptive, yeah, depending on alliances, ideological positions, which are all shifting as we see almost weekly and monthly. So, how does one make sense of these very competing narratives? We have strong, dominant mainstream media, basically a narrative that is still, at least in my opinion, steeped in an old world. So, how does one who is trying to make sense of all of this navigate these sort of conflicting narratives?
Look, Chandran, I think first of all, we have to depart from these dominant Western narratives, which see China as a rival, as a threat. And these are because of the enormous cultural capital invested in places like Washington, D.C., and New York and London. they're able to promote this narrative at the expense of all other narratives. What I would like to do is actually zoom out a little bit, not just look at international relations, economic relations in the present, but look at China's broader role, or even more than that, look at the role of late modernizing societies, societies that start to modernize late, start to industrialize late. By late, I mean long after most powerful Western powers have industrialized and become superpowers, acquired disproportionate power in the case of United Kingdom, and had the ability, obviously, these Western imperialist powers to force powerful civilization states like China to do their bidding. Now, what happened, of course, starting in the early 20th century, was a process of liberation from Western imperialism. And I think you could see in retrospect that China's mission to liberate itself from these decades and decades of Western imperialism and the curtailing of its sovereignty, that has been the most successful of all the many such attempts, starting in 1949 with the establishment of national sovereignty, and of course with the expansion of the Chinese economy in recent decades. This is the most striking instance of a post-Western country, a late modernizing country, developing, becoming a superpower. Now, historically, the late modernizing power has been seen as a rival by the major Western powers, and it has been, in a way, checked and very strongly contained. A good example is Germany, of course, but even a better example is Japan. When Japan essentially tried to be a rival to Western imperialisms in Asia, it was very viciously attacked and contained. Now, China poses a completely different set of problems to the West because I think it invested very early in a project of accumulating national wealth and national power. That was the project right from the early 20th century. And as I say, China has succeeded in this project way better than any other country in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now, of course, China is not an imperialist power like Japan was. It has boundary disputes with many of its neighbors. It has various needs that leads China to reach out to far-flung countries in Latin America and so on. But it's not an imperialist country in the sense of occupying territories around the world, waging wars in different parts of the world, imposing its ideology, imposing its way of thinking on the rest of the world. So it's a very different kind of late modernizing power. And I think the Western narrative insists on presenting China as this sort of demonic threat to the international world order. But what do we see now? Well, we see that China actually, simply by refusing to play this role, by refusing to wage wars, by refusing to kind of force countries around the world to swallow its ideologies, particular ways of thinking, is simply setting an example that there are other ways of being a powerful country in the world. And I think there is so much that is imperfect about China, but I would say at this point at least, China presents a much more attractive model to various countries around the world, various peoples around the world, in terms of just a model of a superpower that is not aggressively expansionist or indeed old-fashioned imperialist in the way the United States is now very clearly emerging as. So I think there's a kind of longer historical dynamic we have to be mindful of, that there was an attempt by the white imperialist countries to grab the resources of the world, to grab territories, to have these economies dependent on this kind of expansion, this kind of accumulation of resources and territories. And that model finally was checked. It was turned into something else in the mid 20th century. And now we are seeing a kind of return in the United States. You see that very clearly. Trump threatening to annex Greenland, threatening to make Canada a 51st state, turning Gaza into Riviera. All these smack of a certain kind of social Darwinist 19th century imperialism. So in a way, it's going back to a certain white supremacist mentality and outlook. So when you look at that and when you look at China, the differences are very stark. So whether or not you're pro-China or pro-India, whatever, you cannot avoid seeing that difference.
That is an extremely useful insight, and I particularly resonated with your point that the stark difference that China has its disputes with neighbors. China does have needs which necessitate it to go to other parts of the world, etc. But it is not in this, we're operating in the same mode. And your point that it is also making others understand there are other ways that we can live together, have our own interests, but don't go forward with plunder, occupation, and hegemony over others. I think this is
And I think more than that, Chandran, I think there's the assumption in so many of these Western narratives is that conflict with China is inevitable.
mm.
And I think we have to challenge that. We have to say, why is it inevitable? Simply because you've made so many deep investments in military technology, in your military bases, in this huge war-making machinery, not just investments in arms industries, but creating a whole intellectual industrial complex that spends most of its time justifying these absurdly expensive investments. So I think it's a whole system geared towards conflict making. And I think we have to be extremely wary of that. It constantly seeks new enemies all the time. This has really now become the biggest threat to world peace at this moment. And, there were, of course, some very wise Americans actually warning against this tendency right after the end of the Cold War, is that we've built up this huge defense war-making machinery. What are we going to do with it? We have to think about really kind of cutting it down. Otherwise, it's going to take over our domestic policy, our foreign policy. And this is something President Eisenhower said, and that is precisely what has happened. So we're constantly invited to think about places like China as military threats that has to be contained, that has to be sort of cornered, that has to be surrounded. So you have Quad, you have all these alliances and organizations. It's a kind of madness. It really is a kind of madness. And again, there are continuities there between the Biden administrations and the Trump administrations. We should not think of the Trump administration as any kind of aberration in this regard. There's a very profound bipartisan investment in this idea of conflict being inevitable and having to prepare for this conflict.
Thank you, Pankaj. And we don't have time to get into it, but I've always argued this sort of reference to historical precedents and therefore saying great power wars are inevitable and conflicts must arise is sort of steeped in a whole different understanding of the world and suggesting that humanity has not progressed at all. So one point I'd like to ask you is clearly one of the most pressing concerns today is the sort of ineffectualness of international law and also of the dear United Nations. It has been almost turned into something that's so lame, yet I think all reasonable people understand we need a United Nations. It's based on the old post-Second World War sort of framework. So what role should China play in making more effective, if it can? And I think those of us who know will say that is going to be difficult, but is there a role for it? And specifically, I think many would be very interested in your comments of how might China support the expansion of the UN Security Council to create more pressure on the old world sort of Security Council members to include powers such as India and the African continent. So do you think China can play a role? And even if it does, will that change anything in terms of the effectiveness of the United Nations? Does it send a different message to the whole world? What changes?
First of all, I would say that, look, there is absolutely no question that the institutions, the organizations supported the so-called rules-based international order after the end of the Second World War in 1945. These were institutions invested with a great deal of moral prestige, and these were the institutions enforcing certain international laws, certain international norms, certain ways of coexistence. But in retrospect, it's very clear they were still obliged, they were still profoundly indebted to the modes of imperialism to the imperialistic frameworks originally devised in the 19th century. In other words, they were profoundly parasitic on Western power. So if you look at the United States today, not only its location in America, where it's under attack from the current administration, but all through the last few decades, United Nations, various other institutions, various other international institutions have been, in a way, controlled, determined, I would say, by what America perceives as its interests. And so there is definitely no question there is a profound need to reconfigure some of these institutions to make them more responsive to the vast majority of the human population that is not Western, that is not American, that accommodates all these various other countries, especially countries that have become economically, politically, diplomatically more powerful. This project has been on the table for a very long time. It's been articulated separately by countries like India, saying, we are a large country. Why don't we have a seat at the Security Council? What business does a small, insignificant country like the United Kingdom have occupying this seat in the Security Council? This is only a legacy of the imperialist period, really. What role does the United Kingdom have today in world politics, except as a poodle, as a pet poodle of the United States? So, all these sort of questions, when you start asking them, they're unanswerable. They're simply unanswerable. So there is definitely a need. Now, I think there is the kind of broad expectation that China could play a role in reforming some of these institutions with its vast military and economic heft. But I don't think that process is going to be very straightforward or very smooth, partly because can you see a scenario in which the United Nations is weaned of its dependence on American power? Not just its American location. Can you see the United Nations actually having headquarters and location outside of the United States? Maybe it's possible. But it'll take a very large shift of geopolitical power. It'll take perhaps a very severe crisis for that to happen. Perhaps we are heading to that crisis. But I think definitely countries around the world harbor this wish to create a new structure that can essentially accommodate human needs for peace and stability and order. And that this existing structure, and that we see now, this vast bonfire of international norms and laws in Gaza, what we've again seen that all these United Nations, NGOs, International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, they can all be rendered toothless by the United States. And we don't want that situation. Most people around the world do not want this. Now, can China produce an order? Can China work towards an order that actually does accommodate these kinds of aspirations for a more peaceful and stable? It all remains to be seen. But I think what we are seeing very clearly right now is a shift away, a loss of belief, a loss of legitimacy of institutions that rely too much upon Western power and Western hegemony.
Thank you, Pankaj. So can I just pick you up on one point? I wrote something a couple of weeks ago, the rebuilding of the relationship between China and India. I was in India in February and I said it would be the relationship that would change the course of the 21st century. And I was in India and most people laughed at me and said it's not possible. But can you just comment on the new sort of China-India relationship? Where could it go if both sides, and particularly India, saw the need to strengthen this? Or is it going to be, as the cynics say, something that's just going to last for a few months before the need to divide and conquer in the old world order has its say? I mean, you know both countries, particularly India. What do you think about this new relationship? And then I've got one more question for you.
Again, Chandran, I think we have to respect the broader historical dynamic here. These are both countries that suffered from Western incursions, Western curtailments of their sovereignty, were humiliated by Western powers over a long period. And that's something that brought them together, starting in the late 19th century. So the history which I've written about of contacts between Chinese thinkers, Chinese leaders, and Indian leaders and thinkers goes back all the way to the late 19th century. I think before China became a republic, it's really important to keep that history in mind. And there was a then continuous contact between the two leaders, between the two countries. And what was the shared project? The shared project was liberation from Western control, Western rule, indirect or direct, and the creation of a new Asia, which was not going to be controlled or determined by Western imperialism. That project, after the 1940s, after India and China became sovereign, was, of course, sort of there in highlighted by Nehru and then the then leaders of China and the sort of Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. I kind of grew up with that idea. So many people in India grew up with that idea that these were kind of, in a way, natural friends and allies, these two great powers of Asia. There was obviously rivalries between them. There was a question of borders that had been, in a way, messed up by British imperialists. A lot of outstanding issues there that had to be settled, still have to be settled there. But I think, as I say, the longer historical dynamic made an alliance between the two countries and historical inevitability. So I've been a critic of this whole recent Indian attempt to go over to the American side and assist the United States in some kind of an alliance against China. Because I think this is really, in a way, a rejection of history, a rejection of basic common historical sense. Because ultimately, the United States, as I said, is going to recover, and it's become now very clear, a certain kind of imperialist outlook and mentality that was latent for a very long time. And now it's completely explicit, completely naked. And in the process, it would humiliate India, which it has done in just the last 2 months. It's not just kind of economic tariffs or 50% tariffs on India, it's people in the Trump administration openly mocking India. Not just India as a geopolitical or military entity, but Hindu religion. What is going on here? What is going on here is naked white supremacism, naked racism. Is this what India wants to be part of? So I think, again, India has been forced into, especially people who were planning this great alliance with the United States, they've been shocked into rethinking their priorities, rethinking their strategies. And I think India and China have to work together. They have to work together. They are natural allies, they are natural friends.
Thank you, Pankaj. One more question, and we could have a discussion for an hour, and I'm sure the entire audience would love it, but we have some time constraints. So one question is, India is obviously going to be such an influential player with all its imperfections, but also its huge potential. But coming back to the China-US tensions, I think most reasonable people will say China is not picking a fight with the USA. The USA is being hostile. So the question is, how long do you think, and you say it's bipartisan as well, how long do you think the Americans can sustain this hostility, given that if China and the US work together, it seems almost a utopian idea at this stage, the world will be a much better place, as we all know, from everything to do with poverty alleviation to development to climate. In your view, as someone who looks at these things closely, do you think it's in the political realities of the United States to seek some sort of arrangement with China and eventually India with this greater power sharing? And if not, how long can the US and I dare say the European allies maintain this hostility for all the reasons you've already mentioned? Are we going to see the US and Europe embrace a multipolar world? So that's the last question I have. I know it's a big one, but if you could concisely try and respond to that, please.
A lot of the phrases that we use in these contexts right now sound so impractical and unrealistic.
Mm.
Because if you look closely at the United States, what's going on there? It's suffering both domestically and in its foreign policy from a case of post imperial derangement. So, when a country goes mad like this, when a big superpower becomes so erratic in its thinking, in its policy making, when it's becoming so nakedly racist and aggressive and expansionist and so disdainful of international norms and laws, all bets are off. The vision of China as a threat, which, as I said, has been pursued by successive American administrations, the preparations for war with China, which is part of the logic of the whole US defense intellectual industrial system, all that has been heading towards, in a way, a certain kind of conflict with China, which I won't rule out at all. And especially now, given these circumstances, given this extremely volatile climate we are living in right now, where a war with China might seem to some adventurer in the White House as a way of uniting what is an increasingly polarized society in a state of low intensity civil war. So I think these are the dangers one has to be now alert to. When one looks at a country like United States and one looks at it primarily its foreign policy, its postures to other countries, we have to now pay very close attention to what is going on within the United States, because that is going to determine its foreign posture more and more and more. And I have a lot of fears about this because I think the possibility of a military adventure has gone up dramatically just in the last few months since Donald Trump came to power. We already see that in these little adventures with Venezuela and elsewhere. And I think these people have so little rational thinking going on that I would not rule out some larger military adventure. So, to answer your question, I'm sorry to be so discouraging in that regard, but I do feel the chances of conflict are higher than at any time before in my lifetime.
Pankaj, there's so much that I'd like to peel away from that, but particularly for those people who are interested, your good friend Chris Hedges put out something last night on Substack in response to the assassination of a very conservative supporter of Donald Trump and talked about what you just referred to, a sort of low intensity civil war. But what you've said is to distract from that, foreign adventures, to unite the country. And your fears, I think, are shared by many, that this sort of internal politics essentially triggering foreign policy is something that we've all had to live with. And I can go back to even the Vietnam War and argue was all part of internal politics and then foreign adventures as well. So Pankaj, I have to stop now. We'd love to have you back. We've got tons of questions coming in, but we'll take that as it goes. But one of the things I'd like to say to everyone here is please do, if you're interested, we've sent you a link to Pankaj's website. But there's a couple of books I'd like to recommend that Pankaj has written, which I think are really germane to all of this. The Age of Anger, From the Ruins of Empire, a fantastic book to read. And more importantly, just recently, The World After Gaza. Pankaj, in 1 minute, what's your next book about?
I don't know yet. I don't know yet. I'm
Okay.
just waiting, yeah, seeing the world as it unravels really too quickly. And this is really, I feel like this is not the time to start thinking about the next book, but to be extremely alert, really.
Thank you, Pankaj. And we look forward as we're working to welcome you to Hong Kong. And I'm also hoping to take you to Malaysia. So we look forward to having you over. Thanks a million for taking time from your busy schedule to be here. And I'm sure a lot of people have tuned in and learned a great deal. Thanks, Pankaj.
Thank you very much, Chandran. Thank you for having me.